Hi everyone, it's Stan. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the Falkbeer Countergambit, which is a dynamic and sharp gambit that black can play in response to the King's Gambit. This is a must for any King's Gambit player, such as myself, to know, since it allows black on the second move of the game to take white completely out of any King's Gambit book they might know. To start off, the gambit begins with e4, e5, f4, and then d5. And now, even on move 3 of the game, white has a big decision: accept or decline the gambit. As with most gambits, it's actually best for white to accept. There isn't really a decline line that I could find, meaning that by far the most played move in this position is e captures d. Before we go any further though, let's look at some of the other possibilities for white and why they aren't as good. First of all, the one move that she should never play as white in both the King's Gambit decline and the Falkbeer Countergambit is f captures e. The reply from black is as brutal as it is simple. Queen to h4 check, and white is in a lot of trouble. If the king bumps up to e2, queen captures e4 check, followed by bishop to c5 check, and, well, you get the idea. If instead, in this position after the queen check, white blocks with the pawn, the queen gets a nice fork on the king and the rook, and it's already lights out. So again, f captures e right here can be ruled out right away. There's also the very rare and dubious d4, known as the Hinrichsen Gambit. What that can look like is e captures d, queen captures d4, knight to f6, knight c3, knight c6 attacking the queen, and the bishop deploys with a pin to b5. Black can capture de, and once the queens come off, black is actually just up a pawn. Both sides have some defects. Black can't castle, and white has a weakened kingside, but they simply cancel each other out. But with the extra pawn, black is still sitting pretty. If we back up here into this position after the initial gambit offering, another response that you might see is bishop to b5 check, but this is no good. It's refuted with c6, gaining tempo and kicking the bishop back to the ultra-passive e2 square. Also, there is, instead of bishop to b5, you can play knight to c3, but this just invites d4, and black now has space in the center, tempo on the knight, and white is going to have a difficult time developing. Finally, another response might be knight to f3, which is a little better, but still not that great. What you can have here is d captures e, knight captures e5, bishop to d6, d4 to support the knight, e captures d en passant, bishop captures d3, knight f6, both sides castle, and then the knights come out to c3 and d7. And in this position, it's actually completely dead equal, which might not sound too bad, but remember, white out of the opening is trying to maintain initiative. If black can equalize out of the opening, especially in something like the King's Gambit, that can be counted as a small victory for black. So in short, just to back up to the original position where the gambit is offered, as with most gambits, you should just accept it. Now for black, there are two main ways forward: c6 and pushing e4. We'll look at c6 first, which is a bit more modern, but I'm actually not sure that it works out all that great. If we have c6 from black, white here can develop knight to c3. Black can take the pawn, white gets the other knight out, black develops knight to f6, d4 from white, and bishop to d6. White here can check with the queen, black can block with the queen, and once they're exchanged, by the way, black here is going to take with the king since the bishop already played to d6, and with the queens off the board, black will be okay artificially castling. After the king captures, the knight is going to jump into e5. Black takes the pawn, the knights are exchanged, and then you have bishop captures f4, supporting the knight and capturing a pawn. And here, white still has a bit of the initiative. Structurally, black has an isolated d-pawn, which could turn out to be an asset or a liability. So, in short, I'm just not sure that c6 is the way to go. It doesn't really give black any sort of decisive advantage out of the opening, and again, if you're going to play something like the Falkbeer Countergambit, you're going to try to play for some sort of advantage. The only way c6 might pay off is in this position. If we back up to c6 being played, the only way that it's really going to pay off is if white gets greedy for material and plays something like d captures c. Black can recapture and develop. White pins the knight. Black captures ef. White develops the knight. Black plays bishop to d6. We have d4 from white. Knight to e7, and then castle, castle. Knight a3 looks weird, but the knight is just pivoting there on the way to c4. And just for a second, I wanted to get really technical. I think the difference between knight to a3 and knight to d2, since from both squares the knight's going to be able to get to c4, I think the difference is that if the knight plays to d2, for just a split second, the knight is obstructing the bishop. And while 9 times out of 10 that won't matter, In trying to get very technical in my own study of chess, I've come to the conclusion that those are the details that actually matter at high level play. So that's why after knight to a3, we can have bishop to g4 with a pin. The knight continues on to c4 to harass the bishop, which backs up. c3 supports d4. Black centralizes the knight. Queen to d3 gets the queen off the back rank and releases the pin on the knight. And then after f6 from black, black now, again according to computer analysis, has a small advantage out of the opening. But again, that line only comes about if white is greedy for material after the initial pawn push to c6 right here. Assuming white is not in fact greedy, again, according to the other line that we saw, I'm just not sure that c6 is worth it. So now, after all that, we finally come to the main line of the Falkbeer Countergambit, which is after ed, black is going to push e4. White here has two responses, knight to c3 and pawn to d3. Knight to c3 is a bit more passive since it doesn't challenge e4 right away and instead leads to a battle for that pawn, as white tries to pile up on it and black tries to maintain it as long as possible. What that can look like here is after the knight plays to c3, we can have knight to f6, queen to e2, bishop f5, h3 is going to prepare to kick the bishop away, so h5 puts a stop to that. And then when b3 is played, white is obviously going to try to fianchetto the dark square bishop because since the pawn is on e4, playing d3 or d4 in this position to open up the dark square bishop is a bit dubious. So the bishop is going to have to come out along the long diagonal in order to get into the game. However, to back up here, there is an alternative that white has after the pawn initially pushes to e4. White can immediately play pawn to d3, which is putting a question to the pawn right away. If black captures ed, then the queen can just recapture, the knights come out to f6 and c3, the bishop deploys to c5, taking advantage of the weakened king side. White plays bishop to d2, both sides castle, although white's going to castle long. And just to pause right here, if you've seen some of my other videos, or you may just know this generally about chess, if there's castling on opposite sides, the game usually is really sharp and a race to the king with the pawns. From here, black develops the knight out to d7, white prepares to fianchetto the light square bishop, and we end up in this position right here. Alternatively, if we go back to the initial push with pawn to d3, if black here chooses to respond with knight to f6, white should just take that pesky pawn right away. Black recaptures, and then we have some knight development to f3. Bishop to c5 sets up a tactic with a fork on f2, so white plays queen to e2 to both get out of the tactic and to pin the knight. Bishop to f5 gets another piece involved. Knight to c3 piles up on the pinned piece, so black breaks the pin with the queen. Bishop to e3 neutralizes the dark square bishops. And then after the knight captures on c3, and when the dust has settled, we've reached this position right here. White still maintains some of the initiative, but it's definitely a fighting game for both sides. So that's the Falkbeer Countergambit. Like I said, it's a sharp game for both sides. It's possible that if you play this as black, you might catch some King's Gambit players off guard, and I know it's always fun to do that in any chess game. But that'll do it for this video. I tried to include as much as I could about the Falkbeer Gambit that I could find. I know that there are some kind of other more crazy lines that can arise in the Falkbeer Countergambit. If you want to post a note about something like that, please feel free to do so. I would definitely love to hear more about it. Also, your thoughts, comments, and questions on the video. Any ratings are appreciated. Hope you enjoyed the video and found it informative. And thanks for watching. Take care. Bye.